Hi everybody, Sally back again on video 4 for the introduction to using a silver reed type knitting machine. And in video 4 we're going to be talking about closed or fixed edge cast-ons. Right, so there's a couple of common methods used for making a closed edge cast-on. You'll hear this a lot. The first one is called an E-wrap, and the second one is called a latch tool or crochet edge cast-on. The E-wrap is slightly less firm than the crochet edge, so it really depends on what you're going to be using this edging for. I don't very often use the latch tool cast-on. I use E-wrap mostly because it's the quicker of the two. Well, for me it is the quicker of the two. But again, it's a question of application. What are you going to knit afterwards? And again, personal preference. Which do you like the look of best? I think the E-wrap probably curls up more than the latch tool one. And well, ultimately, most people with the standard gauge machine end up buying a ribbing attachment for it. And so when you're making garments, you're going to end up most frequently having ribbed edges to it. So these closed cast-ons kind of like lose their relevance slightly. On the LK150 plastic bed machine, I've done 2 video series. One is similar to this, an introduction to the machine. The second one, though, because that machine doesn't have a ribber, I did a whole series devoted to different types of edgings that you could put on your knitting, and all of those methods will equally apply to if you have a single bed metal machine. So if you're looking for something slightly different away from the bog standard E-wrap or latch tool cast-on, take a look at that video series, which is on YouTube, also in the Facebook group Machine Knitting Beginners and Returners Circle, because there might be something in there that catches your eye. I cover latch tool ribbing, mock ribbing, turned up hems, and all sorts of different things. But here I'm going to show you now how to do the closed cast-on. So I'm just going to do a little short one of 40 stitches, and for this the needles need to be out in D position because you're going to wrap around the shanks of the needles. So pull down a good length of yarn, 2 to 3 times the width of what you're going to be casting on, and you want it to be loose. So you don't want there to be any overhead tension. If there's any slack left afterwards, you'll be able to pull it back. So have the yarn loose in your hand. Now make a slip knot. So wrap around your finger, pull through and make a slip knot, and put that onto the needle on the opposite side to the carriage. You can do this in either direction, but I'm right-handed, and so for me it's easier to go left to right, but if you're left-handed you might find it easier to do the other way. In fact, if you're left-handed you might find all of it easier to do from the left. It doesn't really matter. So put the slip knot on the first needle on the left, and then you're going to wrap around the needles, making like you're writing a letter E in cursive writing. So come up between the second and the third needle, wrap it back over the second, up between the third and the fourth, wrap it back over the third. Now use your left hand to keep these pushed back towards the sinker post, because you need to keep these wraps loose. Don't pull it tight, because what's going to happen on the next row is that these latches have to close and pull through those loops that you're putting around the shanks of these needles. And if you've wrapped it as tight as you can, there just isn't enough give for the needle to pull through the loops. So keep them loose. Oops. That looks a bit wonky. All right. I'm going to continue this all the way over to the other side. And this is where I find my clothes peg handy, so I'm going to clip it on the end of the needle so that as that then loosens off, it's not going to pop off the needle. So now I'm going to pull back the slack on my yarn back towards the cone on the back of the knitting machine and feed the yarn back through the carriage as before. And there we go, take the peg off when you're ready to knit. Same tension as before, your main tension. No change to the settings, side levers forward, russell levers on 2, and knit across. Now if you've wrapped it too tight, your carriage will probably jam. If you've wrapped it a little bit too tight, you might find it a bit of a shove to get across, but it will go across. So if you are finding it a bit of a shove to go across, that's an indication that next time you need to do it a little bit looser. Now, here's another one of my ravel cord tips. I just love this stuff. I couldn't knit without it. Now, the common hint for people when they're teaching you to do E-wrap is they say, after you've done this first row, push all these needles out to D so that the stitches don't come off the hooks. Well, that's all very well if you only got 30 or 40 stitches in play, but when you've got 150, 60, 70, whatever it is, that's an absolute pain in the whatnots to do for 3 or 4 rows until your knitting is established. So again, take your ravel cord, make sure it's got no knots, and exactly the same as you did with the ravel cord cast on, put it between the sinkers and the hooks of the needles and knit back. A few rows, pull the cord out. Another couple of rows, and you've got enough to hang your weights. So this is E-wrap cast on. Now there are lots of variations to E-wrap cast on. You can find them on YouTube. Double E-wrap. You can use a multi-stranded E-wrap to give you a nice fancy edging. There's quite a lot of possibilities, but that's how to do the basic E-wrap. And cut my yarn using the handy yarn cutter. And take it off. Now as you can see, I hope you can see, you've now got a closed edge on this piece of knitting. It won't come undone, you can't pull that undone. But as you can see, it's also rolling up. So if you want to use that on as an edge for something, you need to use a yarn that you can press or block and press afterwards. This is an acrylic, so you'll struggle with acrylic. But has its uses. Right, so the next one is the latch tool cast on. Again, you need to pull, I won't do quite so many this time, it takes a bit longer. So I've got 30 needles and pull them out to D. And you need to get your latch tool. Oh, I thought I'd lost it, there it is. And again, you want to pull down a good length of thread. You want to have this loose. I'll pull you a little bit closer for this one so you can see what I'm doing. Oh. Right, make a slip knot, and this time you are going to, again, put it on the end needle. Oh, no, sorry, ignore that instruction. You put it on the latch hook itself and tighten it up around the shank of the latch tool. Now hold the the short end of the yarn, the bit that's not still attached to the cone, in the same hand as the latch tool, so that you don't start knitting with it by mistake. And make sure that again is not pulled too tight, because you've got to make a stitch with this. So push the tool up between needles 1 and 2. Again, you're starting opposite end to the carriage. Put the end of the yarn into the open hook and pull the latch tool down, and the latch should close and make a new stitch. Then you push up between the next 2 stitches, hook in and pull down, and repeat that all the way across. Now make sure you pull a nice big bit through to create a loose stitch. Again, this needs to be loose, this cast on, because if you make these loops too tight, the carriage can't cope with knitting the first row back. So this is just one of those things that requires you to develop the technique. But it makes a firmer edge than the latch tool, than the E-wrap cast on, and it's quite a good one for if you want to use it as a finished edge on your item. It can also be a nice alternative edge to the mock rib. But, that's another story. So this is how to do latch tool cast on. Oops. And when you get to the last one, hook that onto the needle. Then take that end of the yarn down between the last 2, thread your carriage up, and again you need to pull the slack back so that you've got your overhead tension back again, and then knit the first row. There we go. You can, as before, use the ravel cord to hold that in place. Pull it out once you've got, oops, pull the wrong end, once you've got enough knitting to hang some weights on. And carry on. Now, as to moving the weights up regularly, I usually do it roughly every 20 rows. And once I get to that point, just lift it off and move it up. And again, I put it about ½ an inch below the open edge of the knitting that's on the needles. If you put them too close, they can get caught in the knitting arm, so don't put the weights too close. You can keep a central weight down in the bottom if you like, to keep the whole thing down. Again, move the weights up regularly to keep these edges knitting off nicely. So there is your latch tool cast on. 2 closed methods of casting on cut yarn. And remove from the machine. And here we've got the latch tool edge. As you can see, it's a little less stretchy than E-wrap, so it's a bit firmer, but it produces a nice edge, particularly if you want it as the showing edge of your knitting. It's a nice one to do, but so you need to be able to press it, because it doesn't curl quite as readily as the E-wrap one, but it will still curl. So there is your 2 closed or fixed edges. Now, the last method I'm going to show quickly on here is using a cast-on rag, because this then introduces the concept of using your ravel cord to knit a separation row. Now, quite often you put waste yarn on the machine to start off with, particularly if you're going to go straight into a complex stitch pattern like lace or tuck, where you need to have weight on the knitting straight away. And if you haven't got enough weight on there, because you're starting your pattern literally on row 1 or row 2 of the knitting, you might have problems with it actually being able to pattern correctly. So having waste knitting on the machine and then knitting the ravel cord through the needles to provide a separation row is a good way of giving the fabric that stability it needs to knit the complex stitches. So here instead I'm going to use a cast-on rag, and I'll show you in a minute how to actually make a cast-on rag. But a cast-on rag is a bias piece of knitting. As you can see, it's knitted on the slant, and by using a simple increase it creates these loops along the edge of it. And what you do is you use your cast-on rag, pick up the edge loops and hook them onto the needle hooks using a transfer tool. Once you've got a few on, put a weight on so that they don't pop off again. Make sure you're picking up a new loop each time. Let's do a couple more. Because this tends to be a bit frilly, you need lots of weights on here. You can push these needles out to D position if you so wish. So that has now put an area of suspended knitting on there on which you can put weights on. But before you start putting your main yarn in, you need to knit a row of ravel cord. And to do that, you feed it by hand through the carriage. I'll move you back a little bit again so you can see what I'm doing. Here's my green ravel cord and I'm putting it in the carriage. Just leave a tail hanging underneath and hold it in your hand over and knit across. And you'll feel it bite onto the stitches as it's knitting them. That's how to hand knit one row of ravel cord, and now you can cast on with your main yarn. Now I would like to cast on in that direction, so I need to make a free pass of the carriage. If you remember in the intro when I said what's this knob for, move it. This knob releases the carriage and it enables me to move the carriage over to the other side without all the knitting falling off. So free pass of the carriage. Now push these out to D, and I'm going to do my E-wrap cast on. Fall off. Again, keep it nice and loose, no pulling tight. Well, this, to a beginner, can seem a hellish, fiddly process, but the more you do it, the quicker you get at it, like anything, isn't it? There we go. So pull my excess yarn back and feed through the carriage. So now I've got my E-wrap cast on adjacent to the ravel cord, which is still in the hooks, and knit across. There we go. Now I don't need to bother with any other ravel cording or pulling out to D. I can just carry on knitting because I've got weight here. And if I wanted to do a fancy stitch pattern, having that here providing the weight and the stability means I can start the stitch pattern immediately after I've cast on. This might not make much sense at the moment, but it will eventually. So there we go. So I'm going to take the weights off and remove. And now to take the cast on rag away, I need to pull out the ravel cord and they come apart. So you can now use your ravel cord again, and there's your cast on edge on your piece of knitting. But if you're going to use a cast on rag, you must do the separation row with a ravel cord, otherwise you won't be able to get the cast on rag off unless you cut it off, and you don't really want to do that if you want to reuse it. Now to knit a cast on rag, they only need to be about 12 stitches wide, so I'll put about 6 stitches out to work either side of 0, or maybe 7. And you want an E-wrap cast on. So I've actually done 14 stitches on here now. There we go. Thread in to the carriage. And knit my first row. Oh look, I've got a loop. Doesn't matter, it's only a cast on rag. So, just because I had my overhead tension wasn't tight enough. So after about 4 rows, pull the cord out and put a weight on it. And what you now need to do is you need to decrease on the left edge, pick the stitch up, move it to its neighbour, and on this side put a needle out into work, so push it right out to D position and knit 2 rows. Weight on this side, so decrease on the left, move the stitch in 1 and make an increase on the right just by pulling the needle out. Decrease on the left, increase on the right. Now you can pull these needles out to D position all the while that the rustle levers are on 2, because they will just knit back. So, and then you just continue doing that until you've got a long enough piece for a cast on rag. Now obviously to get 200 loops down the edge of one rag, if you want to make one that's going to cover the whole width of the machine, means that as you move diagonally across here with the casting rag, at some point you have to take it off, move it back, and then carry on knitting. So the best thing to do is to start over on the left hand side, knit all the way to the right and stop, and then go back and make another one, so you've got 2 cast on rags. So it doesn't matter if you use 1 or 2. If you need to use a cast on rag across the whole width, use both of them. And then when you get to the end, you'll need to cast off, but as we haven't done casting off yet, I'll show you how to do that in the next video. But for now, I'm just going to break this off and show you the loops. So there you can see the big loops caused along the edge of the knitting from the simple increase, and then obviously the decrease on that side, which keeps it the same width all the way along. Some people weight their cast on rags. You can buy those strips of like curtain weighting, and then you can just like tack it to the non-loopy side of your rag, so you've got a ready weighted rag. I've not done that, but it sounds like quite a good idea. So that is the basics of how to make a cast on rag. Right, so next video will be about casting off.